Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
My name is Emily Carter, and if you had asked anyone in my family who I was a year ago, they would have probably answered in vague terms, something like our oldest daughter or the quiet one. But they never would have spoken about me the way they did about my siblings. My brother Daniel was the golden boy, the one who got his first car the second he turned 16, a shiny used Jeep that my parents bought him under the excuse of setting him up for success. My younger sister Lily was the darling of the family, the one with endless cheerleading competitions and recitals that my parents never missed. Me? I was the background noise, the one who filled in the empty chairs at the dinner table, the one who worked nights at a diner while taking advanced classes, the one who was constantly told to be practical and focus on school, because, according to them, I wasn't the type of person who got to chase dreams. The funny thing is, I used to believe them. I swallowed every dismissive glance, every forgotten birthday cake, every time they skipped over me in family conversations like I was a ghost at my own table. I would sit there while my mom asked Daniel about his plans for college, and my dad gushed about Lily's routines, and when they finally turned to me, it was only to ask, "How are your grades?" as if that was the only detail of my life that mattered. I remember once telling them I wanted to try photography because it made me feel alive, and my dad laughed, saying, "That's nice, Emily, but you can't make a living pointing a camera at trees." I wanted to scream that I wasn't pointing at trees, that I was pointing at life, but of course I said nothing. Silence had become my specialty. The moment that burned itself into my chest happened on a Sunday evening, the night they announced the trip. We were all sitting in the living room, and my mom had this proud, excited look on her face as she told us she had booked a week at a beach resort. The kids cheered, my dad smiled, and I felt this flicker of hope in my chest, like maybe this time they were including me without hesitation. But then she added, almost casually, "Emily, you'll stay home. This will give you time to really focus on your studies. You know finals are coming up." The words hit me like a slap. They weren't malicious in tone, just practical, dismissive, as though I were a houseplant that needed watering while they were gone. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Don't take it personally, Em, you know how important school is for you," as though my future depended on me being locked inside that house while they soaked in the sun and took family photos without me. Lily chimed in with a smirk, "We'll bring you back a seashell," as if that cheap trinket was supposed to substitute for a week of memories I was once again excluded from. I nodded, pretending it was fine, because that's what I always did. Inside, though, something shifted. Something sharp, something final. That night, while they were upstairs packing swimsuits and sunscreen, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my reflection. My face looked tired, older than my years, but my eyes were burning. I thought about every single moment I had been erased in that house, the photo albums where I was cropped out, the vacations I hadn't been invited to, the countless times I was told to stay quiet, stay practical, stay useful. It was as though my entire existence was just filler in the story of everyone else's lives. And then a thought formed, cold and clear. If they wanted me invisible, then invisible I would become. But not in the way they imagined. I started with a list. I'm not impulsive, I've never been. While they slept upstairs, I scribbled down everything I needed to do, step by step. It wasn't a plan to hurt them physically, I wasn't violent. No, what I wanted was worse, something that would cling to them long after their tans faded and their beach memories blurred. I wanted them to feel the absence they had carved into me. I wanted them to come home to silence so deafening that it rattled their bones. I wanted them to search for me and realize that the girl they dismissed had finally learned how to dismiss them in return. The next morning, my mom rushed around the kitchen, telling me to eat something healthy while she double-checked their bags. My dad handed me a list of chores as though I were their housekeeper. Daniel was already blasting music from his phone, and Lily was snapping selfies in her travel outfit. I watched them go, every detail etched in my memory. The sound of the garage door closing, the muffled laughter as the car pulled away. When the house finally went still, I sat in the living room chair and let the silence settle around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry. I was focused, sharper than I had ever been. That was the moment it began, the second the door shut and the car rolled down the driveway. I knew, as sure as I knew my own name, that by the time they returned, they would not find me waiting at the window. They would find nothing. No trace. No reminders. And for the first time in my life, I smiled, because I had finally taken control of my own story. When the garage door groaned shut and the last echo of their vacation laughter dissolved into the woodwork, the house relaxed its shoulders in a way I had never seen before, as if the beams themselves were relieved to stop performing for the people who treated it like a hotel with a chore chart. And that gentle exhale gave me permission to stand very still in the living room and listen to the quiet that used to make me feel lonely, but now sounded like a long corridor with every door unlocked. I walked the perimeter of the room the way a stage manager would circle a set after the actors have left, touching the frames on the walls, the heavy albums stacked like neglected dictionaries on the bookshelf, the end tables with their water rings that no one ever cared to wipe away, and I told myself that what I was about to do wasn't petty or hysterical or cruel, it was simply accurate. A careful adjustment of the house to reflect the truth of how it had been run for years, which meant stripping out the illusion that I had been a cherished part of the narrative rather than a convenient supporting character. I started with the most obvious things, the pictures that hung in the hallway where my mother liked to pause and sigh about how time flies as though she hadn't spent whole seasons pretending I was a temporary tenant. I lifted each frame and studied the photos one by one, and when I found one where my shoulder was tucked behind Daniel's grin or my face barely visible behind Lily's hand throwing a cheer pose, I slid the back open and freed the photograph like a leaf pressed too long between pages. Then I took a pair of shears from the kitchen junk drawer and did the kind of precise surgery my father always said I would never have the patience for, severing me cleanly from the glossy paper and setting my little clipped silhouette aside while the rest of the picture returned to the frame without me, a better match for how the story had been told to guests for years. I made tidy stacks on the dining table, labeled in my head with private names that pleased me more than they should have, a stack of erasures, a stack of returned items, a stack of replacements, because revenge without order is just a tantrum. And I had no interest in tantrums. I wanted curation, an exhibit they would wander through when they got home, confused and tired, blinking at the smooth spaces where I had once been. The albums required patience, the kind of slow-burn attention I usually used on essays and late-night shifts, and I gave it gladly, slipping pictures from those plastic sleeves that never quite fit, easing them out so the crackle didn't leave evidence, and then, with the same neat hand I used at the diner for adding tips, I trimmed around my outline and reinserted the new, cleaner versions, leaving behind family vacations that looked less crowded, birthdays where the cake candles reflected only in the eyes that people actually toasted, holidays where the tree lights glowed on faces that had given each other the good gifts while I opened practical socks. Every so often I would pause to hold one of my small cutouts between my fingers, paper dolls with my own mouth slightly parted as if I were saying something that no one heard, and I surprised myself by laughing, not a bitter laugh, but something softer. Because even in tiny paper form, I finally felt impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, I had turned to the shadow inventory that most families forget they keep, the duplicates in desk drawers, the extra prints behind the more flattering photos in frames, the envelopes of school picture sheets that come in a tiered bundle no one knows how to store, and that careful sweep netted more than I expected, which made me think the house had always known I was here, even if the people did not. I placed neutral inserts in any frame that looked empty without a photo, the tacky stock images of strangers in perfect lighting holding hands on piers and laughing into sunsets, and the sight of those glossy smiles pleased me in a way that felt slightly wicked, because I knew my mother would tilt her head and swear she recognized those people from church, and my father would say he thought they were the neighbors from down the street, and the room would fill with that peculiar uncertainty that creeps in when you realize your memory has never been as reliable as your confidence. I boxed the paper cutouts gently, not as trophies, but as proof that what I was doing had form and method, and then, for good measure, I wrapped the box in plain brown paper and slid it beneath the attic stairs behind a row of forgotten vases. because sometimes the best part of a secret is letting the house keep it. Along the way, I found little opportunities for small, polite acts of revenge that felt like folding sharp corners into otherwise neat sheets, and each one made me calmer rather than more agitated, which told me I was operating within the range of my sanity and not beyond it. I forwarded my own mail to a post office box I had rented with tip money, the kind of detail that would make detectives yawn but would keep my parents out of my business. I canceled the recurring delivery of my shampoo and redirected the credit card refund back to a prepaid card with my name spelled slightly wrong, a trick a bored cashier had taught me. I swapped the labels on 2 storage bins in the garage so that the bin marked camping gear now held tax documents and the bin marked old paperwork carried nothing but tent stakes and a hand pump, not because I wanted to ruin anyone's day, but because the moment my father opened the bin and saw his careful archive of receipts missing, a single thread of anxiety would tug through him and hum for weeks. I reset the thermostat program, not to make them sweat, but to make the house choose cooler nights and warmer mornings, a reversal that would feel wrong without being obvious, like hearing your own name pronounced in a different accent. I moved a handful of meaningless knickknacks to new positions rotated by a single inch, because I have lived long enough under my mother's eye to know that she notices nothing until something tiny shifts, and then she notices everything all at once. It was almost evening when I stood in my bedroom and faced the last task of the day, the one that reached the deepest into me, because rooms remember more than photographs do, and I wanted mine to stop remembering me with that frantic itch I carried in my chest. I pulled the shoebox of ticket stubs and wristbands from under my bed, the silly little archive of a girl who saved proof of unimportant nights because big nights never came, and I sorted those relics with care, not to destroy them, but to keep only the ones that belonged to me in a way that didn't depend on anyone else's attendance. Then I took down the string of tiny lights I had left unlit for months and wound them neatly, leaving the walls bare except for a single nail where a frame once hung. Because emptiness can speak louder than decoration when you need it to. I packed a small bag, not a melodramatic suitcase that would invite questions if anyone had been watching, just a compact, reasonable bag with clothes that matched and a pair of shoes that did not pinch, and I tucked inside a simple note I had written to myself, not to them, reminding me that this wasn't an escape so much as a correction. Before I turned in for the night, I walked the house once more with the lights low, admiring how differently it breathed without the clutter of my accidental presence, and I realized with a little jolt that my revenge had already begun to work. Because the place felt uncertain, as if it had misplaced a word it needed to complete a sentence, and that lack would itch beneath my parents' skin the second they crossed the threshold. On the kitchen counter, I left a single thing they could not ignore, a framed snapshot from years ago in which I was still small enough to be carried, holding a cardboard sign painted with wobbly letters that read, "Have fun without me," a prop from a school spirit day that my mother once thought was adorable. I removed the glass and left the picture propped naked against the toaster, so the air could touch it and the corners could curl, and I smiled because the image said everything I did not plan to explain. The house listened, the attic settled, a far train repeated itself like a lullaby, and I climbed into bed without turning my phone face down, since I had no intention of answering anything in the morning, and as I closed my eyes I felt the pleasant thrum of a plan that was honest and cruel in equal measure. At dawn, when the automatic sprinklers whispered over the parched lawn and the mail truck sighed at the curb, I woke with the sense that the day had arrived into its role like an understudy called up at the last minute, and I stood, stretched, and looked at the clean, careful emptiness I had made, then picked up my bag and opened the front door, letting the air roll past me like an invitation I had been waiting to hear for years, and as the lock clicked behind me with the softest finality, I thought, with a calm that surprised even me, that I had only one more room to erase before the house told the truth without stuttering, and that room required a key I was no longer planning to return. I walked away from the porch with my bag steady against my hip and the odd sensation that the street had tilted very slightly in my favor, not enough to make anyone else stumble, just enough to let me pick up speed without looking like I was running. And by the time I reached the bus stop, I had already opened the Notes app on my phone and started working down the list that looked like a renovation schedule for a very specific kind of house, except the house was my history and the renovation was subtraction performed with a smile and an ironclad Wi-Fi signal. The first stop was the quiet public library where no one talks above a whisper and the clocks sound like they are chewing the minutes. I chose a workstation by the window, signed in under a guest account, and began the small, meticulous work that feels boring until you see the results. Logging into the family cloud, scrolling through the endless folders my mother never sorted, and selecting the images with my face in them using the tool that thinks it is clever about recognizing people, then tricking it with a few manual corrections learned from a late-night forum, so the algorithm began to confuse me with a woman from a wedding we once attended, which meant that every batch delete looked like housekeeping rather than targeted removal. I moved through shared drives and old email archives, through backup accounts my dad set up and forgot the second he made them, through group chats where my profile photo had been a default gray circle for so long that no one would remember changing it. And piece by piece, I lifted myself out like a thread pulled from a sweater, careful not to tug so hard that anyone noticed the pattern changing until the whole thing had loosened around them. When the screens offered up their small victories, I added larger gestures that would land later with a thud, scheduling deletion requests to roll out over the next week for every service that had my name spelled correctly, which felt strangely intimate, as if I were writing future postcards to a family that kept pretending they had moved without leaving a forwarding address. I downloaded the handful of photos I actually loved and slipped them onto a small encrypted drive no one but me could open, because I am not a martyr and I refuse to sacrifice the proof of my own joy just to make a point. I pivoted to the places where erasure is more art than science and began scrubbing tags from social media posts with a mixture of patience and petty delight, untagging myself from Lily's grinning stories, requesting removals from Daniel's throwback albums, editing the privacy settings on the family group so my name appeared as a blank line between my parents like a missing tooth, which, to be fair, fits the way they smiled in public anyway. I even drafted polite messages to a couple of extended relatives who always asked how I was doing at holidays like they were ordering a side salad, apologizing and saying I needed to step back from family platforms for a while due to a heavy school load. Then signing with a new email that looked professional and dry, the digital equivalent of beige paint, because nothing makes people stop asking questions faster than bureaucratic tone. By noon I had crossed town on the bus to a coffee shop whose owner keeps a pot of coffee burning hot and strong enough to cauterize regret, and I printed a scholarship letter on letterhead I designed with ridiculous care, not a fake acceptance to some glamorous place. Nothing that would tip the story into melodrama, just a tidy award from a state foundation that sounded real and sounded boring, the kind of opportunity families forget to celebrate until the photo goes up at a banquet. I folded that letter into an envelope with my mother's name on it and tucked it in my bag alongside a receipt for a prepaid locker at a station where no one looks up from their phones. Because writing a narrative that other people voluntarily follow requires believable props and a rhythm that feels familiar. I stopped at a small bank to confirm that the account I had opened with diner tips could receive the transfer from the prepaid card, made the transfer while the teller typed with nails like tiny mirrors, and felt a tidy click of relief when the balance updated, not because the money was large, but because autonomy tastes better when it pays for its own lunch. On the way out I bought a sandwich in cash and ate it on a park bench while a dad pushed a stroller and narrated the world to a baby who didn't understand the words, but understood the tone. And the image caught in my throat for a moment before I swallowed it down with a sip of water and reminded myself that sentimentality is a luxury for people whose names were never edited out of Christmas cards. The afternoon belonged to misdirection, which I executed with the same cheerful cynicism I brought to refilling coffee for customers who thought snapping their fingers would make the pot move faster. At a thrift store, I bought a suitcase with a scuffed corner and tucked inside it 2 thrifted textbooks from the wrong semester, a stack of folded flyers from campuses 2 hours apart that I had collected over the past month, and a half-used notebook with nothing but neat grocery lists inside that. When glanced at, looked exactly like the life of a busy student. Then I dropped the suitcase at a bus station locker and kept the claim ticket in my wallet under a loyalty card for a frozen yogurt place that closed last year. Because I wanted the breadcrumb trail to feel plausible at first sniff and confusing upon second bite. I set up a timed email from my university address to my mother's inbox, a bland note that said I would be staying near campus for a few weeks to finish a project and that I love them, a sentence I chose without drama because it would infuriate her in all the right ways by sounding reasonable and mature, which is a kind of rudeness she has never learned to process. I also changed the forwarding on the landline voicemail so that calls from unknown numbers bounce to a virtual service with a voice menu, that condescending little robot that asks callers to press options until they give up, because if my parents wanted a maze, I preferred to build one they would think they were navigating correctly. As the light thinned, I circled back to the house for one last pass, not to linger in rooms I had already neutralized, but to close the loop with a flourish that would be small to anyone else and enormous to the only audience that mattered. I replaced the framed snapshot on the kitchen counter with a larger print of the same image, edges untrimmed and slightly crooked, as if a child had taken it from a box, and behind it I left the cleanly cut negative space of me from half a dozen other photos. Pale silhouettes arranged like petals beneath the toaster so that when my mother moved the frame to wipe the crumbs she would see the outlines and remember that even scissors leave a contour that the eye keeps trying to fill on the fridge. I magnet a grocery list composed entirely of items no one likes and a reminder in my father's handwriting to pay a bill he had already scheduled, small irritations that would make them feel briefly incompetent in the house they ran like a company. Then I reset the smart home app to forget my phone as a recognized device, not out of paranoia, but because I found a quiet satisfaction in making the house say unknown when I walked by, a status it has effectively assigned to me for years. And with that done, I slipped my key into an envelope and mailed it to a box I had rented under an initial, so that if anyone ever traced the route it would lead to a clerical shrug. I lay that night in a room across town with a door that locked from the inside and a window that faced nothing in particular, and I watched the paired dots of a distant plane slide past like two patient eyes, feeling not triumphant, but properly aligned. Like a picture finally straightened after leaning for years, and as sleep edged closer I sent a final delayed message to an old family friend who never took sides, a woman who once squeezed my shoulder at Thanksgiving as if she saw something the others missed, asking her, very politely, to check on my mother when she got home because there might be confusion, wording it just gently enough to spark concern without igniting panic. Then I turned the phone screen down and closed my eyes. In the morning I would be gone in a way that could be explained a dozen different ways depending on who was telling the story, which was exactly the point, because revenge that announces itself is just theater, and I was after something quieter and more permanent. So when I finally exhaled and let the dark take me, the last thought that threaded through was simple and clean, that the house would open its mouth tomorrow and fail to say my name, and the silence would be loud enough to start a search in all the wrong directions. They rolled back into the driveway in the late afternoon with the sluggish energy of people who have hugged too much sun and not enough shade, the car doors opening in a sequence that sounded like a tired drumline. And although I was not on the porch to watch faces at close range, I had positioned the view I needed through two simple channels, the first being Mrs. Abbott across the street who texts the way some people knit, steady and intricate, and the second being the small doorbell camera that still believed it belonged to the house yet now sent a copy of everything to an account with my name misspelled in precisely the same way as my prepaid card. The first footage made me smile, because it showed the moment my mother stepped into the entryway and paused the way an actress pauses when the line she expected fails to arrive, her voice lifting into a bright call of my name that bounced off the walls and returned without harmonies, while my father set down a bag and frowned at the thermostat as if the numbers had chosen sides in an argument, and the kids did their scatter routine complete with thudding upstairs, a refrigerator inspection, and a complaint about the milk having a smell that milk always had if you sniffed it hard enough. I watched in real time as my mother clocked the empty frames, her glance doing the math, and then, beautifully, she did that small denial act where she straightened a stack of mail and smiled too wide, telling herself the housekeeper must have dusted with unusual enthusiasm, which would have been funnier if we had ever had a housekeeper in our lives. Within minutes, the denial became wobble, and the wobble became a choke, because the family gallery wall told the first truth quickly, a series of frames that still hung in their old positions, but now offered landscapes. A wedding we once attended without me because I had exams, and a stock photo of a laughing couple in nautical stripes whom my mother would swear she recognized from the neighborhood book club, and the sight of her fingertips tapping the glass as if it might reveal a second layer made something inside me settle with a click I had been waiting to hear for years. Daniel tried to fix it with logic, which is his favorite sport, proposing that there had been a power surge that somehow erased printed matter, and Lily, bless her glittering priorities, announced that the lighting in the living room was suddenly very harsh, and maybe that was why the frames looked wrong, while my father stalked toward the albums with the intensity of a man approaching a safe, flipped one open, and started turning pages faster than any human mind can meaningfully read, landing again and again on images that had been clipped just tight enough to keep me out without disturbing anyone else's jawline. Mrs. Abbott, never one to miss her cue, sent the first text then, a message asking if everything was all right because the "have fun without me" photo on the counter had given her husband the chills. And I answered with the kind of courteous brevity that can keep a pot from boiling over, thanking her and saying that everyone was likely tired from travel. Then placing my phone face down while the doorbell camera caught my mother, removing the frame from the toaster's warm halo and holding it the way people hold an old letter from a person they know they wronged. They called my name again, not with sweetness now, but with the panic they reserve for lost keys and missing confirmations, and when panic did not produce a person, it did what it always does and reassigned itself as blame. My father demanding to know why someone had moved things, my mother accusing him of throwing out the older prints because he disliked clutter, Daniel insisting that I had clearly taken a dramatic turn and that everyone should calm down because this smelled like a stunt, and Lily launching a tearful defense about how she had never touched the albums except that one time she needed a baby picture for a Spirit Week poster, which opened an entirely new skirmish about glue sticks and irresponsibility that would have been comedy if the stakes were lower. The thermostat, patient and unbothered, hummed along to a program that made the kitchen warmer than their skin expected, and my father snapped at it as though warmth were a personal insult, then moved to the landline to check the voicemail and discovered, with increasing disbelief, that the menu now sounded like an airport, a maze of options that funneled him in gentle circles, while my mother found the scholarship letter on the sideboard and read it once with wary relief and once with rising suspicion, asking out loud why I had not called from the resort to say thank you for the week alone before school. Which is the sort of question that only makes sense inside a mind that has never paused to inventory its own habits. By the time the police were discussed and then temporarily dismissed because no one wanted to file a report that might become embarrassing if I walked through the door with a smoothie, the house had finished the part one needed it to play. The rooms offering only blank confirmations and the objects providing small, precise contradictions, and into that soft chaos I placed the next stitch of revenge I had measured weeks ago. A delayed email that reached my mother's inbox exactly as the sun went down, congratulating her on being the parent listed for emergency contact on an academic residency form, and asking her to confirm by reply that she approved extended housing through the end of the term, which, while banal, carried the quiet detonator of suggesting that I had arranged a life that did not require any of them for quite some time. She read it out loud as if the house needed to hear it too, then reread it with her hand on her throat, while Daniel argued that it proved nothing and Lily whispered that she felt sick, and my father said a coarse version of enough that made the doorbell camera stutter with the vibration. And at that perfect moment, Mrs. Abbott knocked with a plate of brownies and the sort of careful face people wear when they walk into a room that might have a ghost. I turned off the feed and let the room I rented go dim around me, breathing in the clean, dull scent of unremarkable carpet, and I allowed myself one small, impolite grin because the day had delivered exactly what it promised. A home full of people who had once wished me quiet, now obligated to listen to the silence together, and as a parting gift, I queued a second message from my university account to send at dawn to my father alone. A tidy note about a missing signature on a financial document. He was certain he had completed, the kind of bureaucratic itch that keeps a man awake counting what else he has forgotten, and when I slid my phone beneath the pillow and closed my eyes, I understood that the next step was not noise, but a deeper absence. Something they could not email or straighten or demand back, because the final answer they wanted from me required a version of me that no longer existed, and I had to decide whether to leave them chasing a shadow or to show them, once and for all, the shape that cast it. The morning arrived with the kind of washed-out light that makes neighborhoods look like they have been politely ironed. And while my parents brewed coffee strong enough to scold their nerves and my siblings dragged the suitcases into corners as if clutter could anchor them to a version of yesterday that no longer existed, a courier climbed the porch steps with a flat package wrapped in brown paper and twine, the sort of old-fashioned presentation my mother equates with quality and my father equates with expense, and because curiosity is a muscle in our family that never skips leg day, they opened it right there on the kitchen island between the bowl of underripe peaches and the framed photo that insisted on smiling without me, revealing a linen-bound album with a small silver plate on the cover engraved with the single practical word, family, a title so bland it slipped past their guard before anyone could demand provenance. They turned pages that felt thick and serious beneath their fingers, finding image after image printed beautifully and cropped even more beautifully, vacations corrected to show only the people who had been celebrated, holidays presented without that extra girl standing just outside the glow, school concerts that looked almost professionally staged because the frame contained only the star and the audience that clapped for the star, and as they paged forward, Daniel tried to manufacture a laugh that died the instant it met my mother's expression, while Lily asked in a small voice why the photographer had missed so many angles, and my father, who has always believed that proof is a synonym for paper, began to look as if the paper were turning on him with neat, smiling teeth. On the final page they found an envelope glued to the cardstock with tidy corners, addressed to the people who live in this house, a phrase I chose because accuracy, though unfussy, can cut just as clean as wit. And inside the envelope lay a note in my blunt handwriting, telling them there was a box in the attic, that the box did not belong to them, and that for once in our long, lopsided story I would appreciate them following my instructions without revisions. Which of course meant that they climbed the pull-down ladder with the reverence of divers approaching a dark surface and found, tucked behind the row of wedding vases no one ever filled, a plain carton with my name in pencil, soft-edged from years of dust I had left undisturbed as if time itself had been waiting for a cue. My mother carried it down like a librarian saving a first edition from a leak, set it on the island beside the album and the peaches, and lifted the lid with both hands, only to find not a single paper cutout or folded keepsake or confetti of my outline, but a small square mirror cushioned in tissue and nothing else, a mirror that caught her face and my father's shoulder and the nervous flit of Lily's eyes and the stubborn angle of Daniel's jaw, and on the backing of that mirror I had written one sentence in a narrow band of Sharpie, "Here is the person you kept seeing past," which, though not a punchline, landed like one, quiet and mean and correct. I had worried, in the hours before dawn when sleep walked off like a bored date, that the gesture might read as dramatic rather than precise, and I had almost replaced the mirror with a stack of clipped silhouettes bundled in ribbon, but precision demands courage, and I wanted them to sit with their own reflections the way I had sat with mine for years. So I let the choice stand and pivoted to the part of my plan that moved beyond paper and glass into the dull machinery of the world, because revenge, if it intends to last, should secure a lease in reality rather than sublet through theatrics. The timed email to the school counselor had already gone out requesting that all communications about my schedule and grades be directed to me alone. The bank account with the diner tips had been linked to the rental office for the room with a door that locks from the inside. The post office box held the first utility notice with my name, and the prepaid phone plan that runs under a misspelled version of my last name had been funded for a year, a set of small decisions that together formed a perimeter sturdy enough to keep out the kinds of demands my family loves to frame as concern. And, while some piece of me understood that their panic contained kernels of care, another larger piece, the one that had learned to read the subtext beneath every favor and default, felt weary of parsing kernels from cob and simply wanted the field to go quiet. I sent a final message to Mrs. Abbott thanking her for the brownies and asking her, in a tone as light as dust in sunlight, to check in on my mother later because the house might be having a difficult morning. And then I walked to the bus with my bag and a composed face that probably looked like bravery to strangers and felt more like finally fitting into my own skin without tugging at the seams. The day unfolded in that slightly cinematic way days do when you have set too many timers and every ding announces consequence, my father fielding a politely worded alert about a signature needed on a financial aid form that did not, in fact, require his hand, my mother receiving a confirmation from a scholarship office that I would be off campus for an extended residency and should be considered safely unavailable for family obligations, and my siblings realizing, with the sort of dawning horror usually reserved for waking from naps in classrooms, that their feeds had hiccuped themselves into galleries that no longer contained a sister to tag, which created a secondary wave in extended family group chats that I muted and archived because I have no interest in performing an exit interview. I did, however, offer one last gift in the afternoon, a livestream link set to my mother's email and BCC to 3 relatives who always used holidays to relitigate other people's choices, an event titled The Portrait Without the Girl, which, when opened, played a slow montage of the corrected family photos while a calm voice, not mine but hired for $30 from a marketplace where people sell their ability to pronounce your thoughts cleanly, read a script I had written in a single sitting weeks earlier, a script that never accused and never sobbed and never demanded apologies, only described, with unadorned clarity, what a house looks like when a person is present in tasks and absent in celebration, what a childhood looks like when the instructions are always to be practical and the reward is always to be left at home, what love looks like when it is itemized. Then the stream ended on a black frame where the words, "Some absences are not losses," hovered for 3 long breaths before disappearing. It would be easy, delicious even, to say that I celebrated with a dramatic toast, that I danced alone in a room rented under a slanting roof like a heroine with new keys. But the truth is I bought a sensible dinner at a small place tucked beside a laundromat and ate it while making a list of the next 3 administrative steps I should complete by the end of the week. Then I walked past a boutique that sold beach hats out of season and allowed myself a small, ridiculous smile at the display. Because humor, even of the faintly mean variety, is a good solvent for leftover glue. I cannot claim certainty that I have done the right thing, and I will not pretend I do not hear the arguments in my own head that sound suspiciously like my father's cadence or my mother's sighs. The part of me that wonders whether I have performed cruelty disguised as correction, whether absence, once installed, grows like ivy and strangles more than it beautifies, and if the answer is yes, then I will carry that like a pebble in my shoe rather than a banner in my hand, and I will learn to walk with it. I will also admit the possibility that I have not gone as far as they think, that the new name on the lease is more translation than reinvention, that I am closer than a map would suggest. Living 2 neighborhoods away where the coffee tastes like the same burnt edge and the buses run on the same forgiving schedule, because starting over does not always require an ocean. Sometimes it requires a hinge that finally swings. And if that proximity makes my choice more unsettling, then perhaps unsettling is the point. Tonight I will place the encrypted drive with the handful of photos I wanted to keep inside the small safe I bought secondhand, and I will sleep under a ceiling that has no opinions about my worth. And in the morning they will wake in a house that tells the truth without stuttering, a house that presents back to them the shape of the family they curated, a house that hums on its new settings and refuses to manufacture a ghost. And maybe they will call the number that leads to the polite robot. And maybe they will write a long message that I will archive, and maybe, in a week or a month or a season, my mother will climb the attic ladder and look for the box again, as if the silhouettes might have regrown, only to find the mirror waiting with its small, unblinking patience. If you are listening for a clean answer, a pin to pop the tension, I do not have one to offer because I am not writing a lesson, I am writing a life, and lives do not resolve on cue. They braid and fray and occasionally hold. So let me leave you where I am standing now on a sidewalk that smells faintly of detergent from the laundromat vents, with a bag that is light because it contains only what I chose, and a future that is heavy in a good way. And a last thought that is neither victory nor confession, but something stubborn in between, that they wanted me invisible and I learned how, and now they will have to decide whether they can finally see the outline I left behind or whether they prefer the comfort of a portrait that looks perfect because it is missing a face.